Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV and for my members, SFO Continuity. I'm very excited to be back from the unofficial end of summer, heading right after the Labor Day break. I hope you all had a great end of summer and a great Labor Day. I know I did, and I am ready for an extremely active week. And my first guest, a returning guest, and one of my most long form interviews a couple of months ago, back by very popular demand. And also, I think we have an incredible topic for all of you today. We're calling it Kites and Hurricanes, Wealth Protection in the Cyber Crime Era. So I'd like to welcome back Michael Irish, the CEO of SedoGravitas Partners. We're going to do a, well, maybe not as much by Angelo standards, but a longer form interview. And he's going to have a chance to share his insights in cybercrime and decision intelligence. Also, wargaming can enhance decision making to predict and mitigate threat vectors and risk in general. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Angelo.
It's a pleasure to see you. This couldn't be a more timely topic. As we're heading into grave challenges geopolitically, a significant amount of challenges happening around the world, and the fact that a bullseye is on the target of people that are out there as being successful, as being investors, as being family offices. And we're going to do a different and deeper dive in many ways with deeper thinking than I think that many people on this subject are used to. And I really look forward to it. And on that note, my first question, what exactly is the threat from cybercrime and cyber terrorist to the enterprise and the investment shops, if I could use that word? And to some degree, is this a bit of hype?
Thank you, Angelo. First of all, for those of you who are returning from Labor Day, I'm honored and privileged to be your first video meeting per se. Your question's intense. What is the threat from cybercrime? What is the threat from cyber terrorism? What is the threat from state and other actors? And I think part of the issue is that the information that we're collecting is uneven. A lot of the information is kept confidential or even more so secret from the public eye, and perhaps it should be. So what some people perceive to be the threat and what other people perceive to be the threat is going to be absolutely different based on their own experiences, which is what we would expect. We talk about conflict and we talk about war as it relates to Ukraine, as we talk, about the Middle East, and potential conflicts in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China. There's a mini-series called The Undeclared War, which I believe is running on Peacock now, that was produced, I believe it was produced by Channel 4 in the United Kingdom with Simon Pegg. And I think that's really kind of what we're looking at here is an undeclared war, not only by nation states, but criminal organizations and terrorist organizations that are working both independently and in collusion with rogue nations. So the fact of the matter is that what is the threat and how big is the threat? It's huge. Right now, if you take a look at some of the numbers that have been published over the last year, it's estimated based on the information that we have that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% and more or more of the entire global economy is one way or another being siphoned off as it relates to activities that are nefarious and illegal and hostile. If we had that kind of damage where 10% of the US economy was gone because one of our enemies, either took down our infrastructure or shut down the internet, which is something that's happening routinely now, or other matters that you can measure and you can see that are tangible and show well on TV, I think it's a threat that's big enough that we would be taking it seriously. So how big is it? If I walk into your average board of directors, whether it's for a pension fund, for a bank, or a family office, and tell you 10% of your assets under management are going to go away, whether in a year, 2 years, or 3 years, I think I'd have their attention. And the problem that we have now is that we really don't have anybody's attention, which in turn is the reason why I'm doing this discussion this morning.
When you mention words like rogue states, like criminal organizations that have a level of scale and in their own way, a level of proper systems, operations, in other words, they kind of know what they're doing. How is a family office representing a significant family or even a multi-family office representing several, having one person pretty good, potentially in IT and cyber, how are they going to address the fact that they may be a target from a variety of perspectives and what they're currently doing just may not be good enough?
Hmm. It's an important question. I think that first of all, let's take a family office or an investment house, right? You've got a CIO, your chief investment officer, then you've got a CIO for, obviously your IT backbone. I think the first issue that you kind of indirectly raised is who's the point of contact, who's the point of failure, who's the point of accountability. I think the first issue is that the boards of directors are not viewing this as an existential threat either to their own organization or to their investors' money. I'm sure that some people watching this, either now or later, are going to disagree with me. This has to become a board issue. And if we want to basically sit back and kick our heels and wait until something that's going to is having more economic impact in some respects than what COVID did, and we don't keep it at the board level, and if it's not a driving matter, then it's really not being addressed with the right people at the right time. The second issue is moving a little bit beyond corporate governance, is where the leadership of organizations are putting their trust. There are multiple third-party organizations that are advising corporations, boards, CISOs and CIOs, et cetera, on what to do or how to do it better. The problem is that the organizations that are providing this advice, with all due respect to my peers and colleagues, are not spending enough time actually looking ahead, and they're spending a predominant amount of time of trying to figure out what the future is going to be based on regression analysis or past incidents and past events. That's not going to cut it. As leaders and as boards of directors or fund managers, et cetera, we have to be a little bit more creative in how we're managing our time and how we're actually understanding existential threats to our enterprise. So until we basically, move this up to the senior most level and hold those individuals and organizations and boards of directors accountable to the point where they may not get underwriters insurance for cybercrime, this is not a legitimate, nor is it being taken as a serious issue. And so, when you start talking about rates of return and protecting the principal, that's all good and well. When you're talking about protecting the AUM, that's great too. But we need to start viewing this as you can not only lose the rates of return, you can also lose the principal in and of itself, and in ways that are actually highly embarrassing and have downstream implications. So it's a matter of governance, it's a matter of perspective, and really ultimately shifting the way we look at things to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more future and forward leaning.
Michael, what is decision intelligence as it applies to decision making, risk mitigation, and I guess I would call it seizing advantage?
Let me just stick with one. Decision making is decision making is dependent on decision intelligence, right? And decision intelligence is just like what it kind of sounds like. It is taking a large aggregation of multi-source information from both structured data, unstructured data, and then putting it all together, analyzing it, sense making, and trying to use that to not only drive forward-looking scenarios, but also decision making in and of itself. And I go back to the notion of perspective. If you're not looking forward, then you're not doing the right thing, first of all. So to seize advantage, you have to be able to see what's coming downstream, right? Decision intelligence is really just that. It's information that informs decision making. And I submit to you that too much of the decision intelligence today is taking a look at very, very old indicators and very, very old case studies and not being creative enough and more forward looking.
That kind of was my next question. If decision intelligence is important to think critically and form a decision, either to mitigate risk or to take advantage of opportunity, how do I know if the intelligence I'm receiving is the right intelligence? How do I know the good from the bad, the average from the great from the terrible?
I think that that's where, unless you have people who have expertise in the category actually in-house, you have to have trusted partners to do that. Your question is simple, but it's sublime and complex. The net is that people who have decades of expertise are still trying to make sense of all the dynamics and indications and warnings that are out there today. So how do you differentiate? Well, there's a multitude of things. Number one is triangulating your sources, having multiple sources that are not mutually informing, meaning to say, if I talk to one person and then another person and then another person, presumptively, I don't want them to know each other. And I want them all to provide similar indicators insofar as what they see is either the problem or the opportunity. All right. And then when you pull that all together, and if it's consistent, then you can assign a little bit more of a probability vector. But really, ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to rely on, whether it's an insider or whether it's a partner, somebody who knows what they're doing and has expertise in this, and also matching that up with, a little bit of creativity to think out of the box. The fact of the matter is that, criminals have been there forever. They're not going to go away. Rogue enemies aren't going to go away. I think the problem that we have now is that the decision-making curve and the degree to which we're actually looking forward in general, is, whether it's quarterly or annually or even longer than that, the time horizons are not really long enough for people to be thinking like, what's going to happen 3, 4, or 5 years out. And frankly, to compliments to those in the defense, intelligence, and government community, they have to put together not only 1 year, but 3-year, 4-year, predominantly 4-year budgets, so that if they don't get it somewhat right on what the budget lines are going to be, then whether it's a technology or a national security strategy or something else, an investment per se, then it's going to be off by the time they get there. So you have to look at a much longer time horizon than a much longer time frame, is the first issue. And that's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of creativity, and it's a matter of having the right people.
And audience, those of you that are my members and select guests in the webinar portal, we do encourage you to interact and ask questions, or at least make comments. It means you're listening, and a lot to learn from your questions as well. And selectively, even some of us joining us live in social media may, depending on a variety of factors, have the opportunity to interact as well. So again, that is something we greatly encourage, and a significant advantage of being live and in the moment, as opposed to hearing it on replay, the opportunity to interact. Michael, what is missing in family office decision intelligence and decision making in anticipating and managing cyber threats?
There's a lot of family offices, and I think each one of them have a different set of core competencies, both internally and then partners that they work with. So I don't think there's just one catch-all answer to that question. But in respect to it, I think that you've got to, number one, put it on the roadmap for the board to be discussing frequently. And again, I go back to corporate governance. If it's not at the board level, if it's not at the managing partner level, then it's not going to get the attention that it needs. So I think the first issue is that it has to be made a relevant issue. And then, from there, what are they missing? What are we all missing? Right now, after AI, decision intelligence is projected to have a combined aggregate growth rate of somewhere in the neighborhood of 24%. And I mention that because a lot of people are not even aware of what decision intelligence is, or that it's a market that's going to go from $15 or $16 billion and then grow 24% annually through 2030. The fact of the matter is that AI is sucking the energy and the attention out of the information ecosphere. But meanwhile, if you ask your average enterprise, are you under attack from AI or cyber? Well, actually, cyber and AI are actually working in combination to challenge the very existence of our financial institutions, family offices being no exception. And if they're not actually challenging the organic assets under management of a family office and or institution, certainly most of the investments, or many of the investments that family offices and financial organizations are making, could potentially be compromised by cyber and by AI combined. And so these are existential threats, whether it's to the organization and the family office in and of itself, or whether it's the assets and investments that they're making on behalf of their team.
Well, that somewhat relates to my next question when you mention cyber and AI being enhanced, more powerful, and more dangerous to those than ever before. And that question is about deepfakes. One, starting a little simplistically, what are deepfakes and why should they matter to an investor, an investment operation, or, of course, a family office?
I'm not going to plug my company or my website too overtly, but if anybody watching this wants to see an example of a deep fake that's done relatively well, I encourage them to go to our website, which is www.sedogravitas.com, SedoGravitas.com. And if you can find it, great. And if you can't, give me a call. What we're trying to do is to take people that don't have a lot of time to understand that the very fabric of their perception, also known as suspension of disbelief, is being tampered with. And it's being tampered with fairly professionally. And deep fakes are generated by a series of complicated, both it's a hybridization between AI, computing power, and really good software, and what we would refer to as special effects ultimately, all coming together with a degree of realism in a way that what you're watching may have something a little bit off, but maybe it won't. And so you end up thinking that you're talking to somebody. You think that you're listening to somebody that you know and have known for years. And the team that's beside me and behind me as a CEO includes some of the finest in not only generating deep fakes, not for criminal purposes, but just as a sample to show folks insofar as how it works, but also detecting them. And it's becoming increasingly more complicated to detect deep fakes. They are frequently video driven. They are frequently audio driven. And there's things as part of the deep fake, visually, audibly, auditorily, that make you think you're actually talking with or interacting with someone that you know. And right now, I can't even say how severe this is, but there's a lot of people making trading decisions and investment decisions over the phone with deep fakes that are only audio. I know other people that are on this meeting today that have been conned, for lack of a better way of putting it, by visual deep fakes. And so if we don't grapple with what's real and what's fake and have an ability to discern and distill what it is, then we're pretty much putting ourselves and our institutions at risk. And I'd say that's a problem. But again, I would steer people back to my website, our company's website, and I think you should be able to find it fairly quickly now that we've tipped you off.
How can we as agents of trust identify risk, kind of an architecture solutions, and mitigate it?
Right. We're talking about something that's on the scale and the magnitude of COVID, except it's more insidious. It's more existential, and ultimately it can destroy the economy if we don't get a grasp over it. If you take a look at some of the leading corporations, Delta Airlines, a major healthcare company that's in the Fortune 100, and it goes on and on and on. These organizations are being not only interrupted, but losing market share, customer trust, and their brand ultimately. But if we want to talk about the way we can actually start to put our best foot forward, candidly, this is not me criticizing either one of the political campaigns that we have ongoing here in the US, but I haven't heard cyber or cybercrime or cyber terrorism or the very integrity of our fundamental corporations being at risk or at stake. And quite frankly, they are. So until we actually make this a policy issue, all right, that's as important to many people as the border or healthcare or other things, then the policymakers don't have any relative compelling event to do anything differently. And so until the policymakers start to put better rules and guidelines and guardrails, I'm not saying government's either the beginning or the end of the solution. What I am saying is that they have a role to play. And the first thing is that the trade organizations and the private sector have to start to lean on government to do the right thing and to take the threats and the risk and the response much more seriously, because right now it's not happening. A lot of the leading cyber organizations that are there to help corporations and to mitigate risk are not on a hiring binge. In fact, if you look over the last few years, many of them are actually tapering off their hiring as it relates to cyber crime, cyber terrorism, et cetera. I haven't heard any policy-making decisions or discussions of any gravity coming out of Washington or the state capitals on this very issue. We hear a lot about other things, but not things that are sucking 10% of the global economy away annually and growing.
What's the future state of secrecy and encryption look like, Michael?
That's the hurricane. You're the kite. It's a problem. If we don't, I mean, imagine, if you will, what the reaction would be in Miami or Palm Beach, right? Or New York. If there was a hurricane, we knew about it, we didn't do anything. I think some people would be fairly irritated and annoyed. Just in the way that our entire very roots of our perception are compromised or can be compromised by deep fakes. When you start to look at the risk from cyber, it's just not getting any attention. And if you take a look at what's going to happen with the advent and the coalescence between AI, quantum computing, and encryption, imagine a world in where data which has been stored for a long time, whether governmental or corporate, has been stored for a long time, and it is encrypted using the state of the art at the time it was encrypted, all coming out in the open. With the continued acceleration and development of quantum computing and what we refer to as post-quantum encryption, whether it's voice, data, et cetera, the vulnerabilities are the same. And quantum computing in the wrong hands takes the inherent power of AI and the creativity and malevolence that exists in cybercrime and cyber terrorism and rogue nations, and puts it on steroids, to put it conservatively. So if we don't start to deal with what's known as quantum safe encryption and post-quantum computing, or quantum computing in general, and that it's actually working with both AI and cyber, we have a problem. And I would observe criminal organizations and rogue states understand how to use the technology and are much faster at doing so. I think all we need to do is look back at, what happened to particular industries when the internet came out. I still remember debates that we were having over digital rights management 20 and 25 years ago. I'm not necessarily sure we have any better digital rights management today. In fact, it may even be worse than it was 20 or 25 years ago. So the net, Angelo, to your question, is that the future state of encryption for not only data in transit, but data that's in storage in the next few years is going to be highly vulnerable if it has any kind of connectivity whatsoever, and is not sitting in a vault 1 million feet below ground, disconnected from the rest of the world. So we have to get in front of this. And in order to basically embed the technology, such as quantum safe encryption, we have to start planning for that now. Companies like IBM and others are trying to be in front of this and trying to tell their customers what it means. And in a not too recent phone call that I had with one of the most successful CIOs in the history of this country, they really were not conversant in the subject of either post-quantum computing and or quantum encryption.
I kind of got the ball rolling on what's going to lead to this question a little while ago, but do family offices have unique vulnerabilities from cybercrime and cyber attacks? And it sounds like a different question. Maybe it is, but I think they intersect. How do international affairs influence that?
Right. Um, I think there's some obvious answers and some not so obvious answers to your question. First of all, many family offices that have 10 or more billion under management start to look more like in my opinion, more of a classic hedge fund and or a classic iBank, right? But any small organization is going to have limited headcount and limited time windows, not only for discussion and planning, but also for, investment decisions and trading and the like. And I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that family offices are not either creative or strategic. They are. And I have a lot of respect for them. They do a lot with very de minimis overhead, and that's something to be applauded. But I think at the same time, there are only so many people that you can actually have inherent and organic to your organization. So in this situation with something that is as bad as it is, for example, we wouldn't expect everybody to have their own preparation for a city if a hurricane was coming. I think we all need to basically tie together, and this needs to be much more profound in those annual meetings like the ones that were up in the Hamptons, which wasn't necessarily a family office convention, but where you're getting a large aggregation of either family offices or investors or VIPs in the finance world and leaders of the free world in general. This has to be much more on the agenda, and it has to be on the agenda now. I think the way that family offices can protect themselves for a low amount of capital isn't necessarily to hire firms like my own, SedoGravitas, buy in where we're going to do a 3-day war game and it's going to be exhaustive. I think that there's much easier ways to enter and gain access to not only best practices, but also downstream information and indicators. But you've got to be able to work with somebody that's going to sit in your boardroom and tell you everything is not well. Now, obviously confidentially, but until we have that wake-up call and until we actually make this a priority, addressing a specific family office is going to be tough to do. I know that after what happened with the Microsoft upgrade and CrowdStrike a number of weeks ago, I talked to a number of family offices, and they were disappointed in the fact that they were not operational. They couldn't access their accounts. They couldn't make trading decisions. They couldn't liquidate positions that were pretty important to them. And in some cases, some of the commercial flights, not the obviously general aviation flights, they couldn't take them because they were canceled. And they were canceled because of a software upgrade gone wrong. So, I mean, it's not always malice. Sometimes it's just people not doing the right thing. And the entire infrastructure and the entire economy suffering because of it. So my answer is that we have to have better sharing of best practices, and we have to be looking farther downstream. And quite honestly, any organization that's managing $1 billion or more should hopefully be more clever than the criminals that are trying to take it away from them.
Sometimes easier said than done, because those criminals can be very targeted. They have a certain inherent advantages, and of course, don't underestimate their capability. What's missing from cybersecurity defense in general?
The number one thing that's missing is it's not a priority, and it's not something that people have right in front of their face every day. That's issue number one, except for professionals like the ones that I work with. That's the first issue. The second issue is that the decision-making is generally reactive and responsive, and a couple orders downstream from where it could have been. Our entire thesis and ethos and pathos as a company is to try to be leaning forward and looking ahead. When I was running this morning in the mountains, I can assure you that everybody else that I was running with was actually, in fact, looking forward and not saying, hey, Bob, a mile ago we had, a rock, or we're going to have a rock in the next step. You have to see what's in front of you, and you have to be able to do so in a fast moving world. Our entire realities change in a matter of seconds and minutes today. And Angelo, I think we both discussed last night, were you going to have connectivity and internet today for this meeting? You didn't know and almost canceled it, right? So we have to be able to predict and anticipate these things. And, there's things like secure out-of-bound communications. After the CrowdStrike, issue, and, whether I'm not particularly a fan of any of the current cell phone carriers here in the US, which I find intractably unreliable. But we have to be able to build a contingency plan for what's going to come ahead. The example that I like to use more frequently than not to demystify this entire discussion is to go, do you have a contingency plan if your building is on fire, your house is on fire, your car is on fire? Do you know what you're going to do before it happens? Typically, the answer is yes. Here in California and San Francisco specifically, despite our incredible leadership here, most people have some grasp of what to do in an earthquake. Don't get on the bridges might be one thing. If you're in a multi-story building, you might want to consider getting out of it. You have to have some kind of foreknowledge and planning, and as ludicrous and ridiculous as it was, during the Cold War, I remember as a child, we're all going to get under the desk for when the nuclear bomb hits. I don't think it would have been profoundly efficacious, especially given that the school was co-located with a nuclear weapons base. But yet we did have a plan. And if nothing else, it made us all feel really good. I'm not suggesting anything that we're talking about today as a feel-good gesture. What I am talking about is the very fundamentals of thinking ahead, and not hour by hour, but rather try and be a little bit more creative. And even if it takes looking at what are supposedly fictitious events and fictitious films and TV series like The Undeclared War, we've got to be creative. The warning signs are out there. And if people on this meeting today don't personally know somebody that's either been on the receiving end or a family member of cybercrime and cyber terrorism, then they're not looking terribly far. And in many cases, they don't even know it.
Related a little bit, Michael, to what you said in the beginning of answering the question, I suppose some may look at it as it's an expense and a growing expense. We maybe have not been hit in the last couple of years. Therefore, it's a drain on us. We don't put it, I think your words as well, and from what I see, as a priority. I think you have to look at the consequences. If something were to happen, would it be minimal and be contained? Possibly. But could it be devastating, from brand and reputation to potentially monetary? I think that potential is possible. And even if that's only 5 or 10%, the risk of that 5% or 10% is devastating. So, in other words, how do you potentially do an analysis to understand? And you mentioned maybe you do a threat surface analysis or red cell, red teaming, people call it different things, to address vulnerabilities and then have them understand these are things that need to be worked on because here's how dire the consequences could be.
I like to drive really fast, Angelo. I really enjoy it. I like sports cars and I like fast vehicles. And of course, I only drive them off public roads, but I also like flying and parachuting and a million other things. If I go through the time and the expense to buy a high performance vehicle, right, which I think a lot of family offices are, or certainly consider themselves to be, maybe conservative, but yet high performance with high rates of return and competitiveness. And if they don't admit that, I'd be surprised. But it kind of like being, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine last week who's got a really, really incredible sports car. And we were discussing ethanol and high octane gasoline. Having experienced a high performance engine basically not work anymore because of ethanol, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, you've gone through the time and the investment of having the best people in the world in your company, in your organization. And, the notion of doing anything to sustain a high performing organization that's not high performance in itself is not in anybody's best interest. And so, is it viewed as a cost? I don't know. I mean, it's the same kind of trade-off analysis that you would do between, essential medications that are life-saving and food. Yeah, they both cost money. What's the return on investment from them, respectively? And what's the downside risk if you eliminate either one? This is more complicated. But if it's viewed as IT just coming in and asking for more money, which I think in many cases it is today, as opposed to waking up and not having access to any of your accounts, your phone isn't working, your flights are being canceled. I mean, that's the way this all needs to be reframed. I had a conversation with an executive last week, and I found out that our proposal to them had been put into the same bucket as a software upgrade. And that's really not the right way to be looking at this. And so if family offices want to continue to not only get returns on their money, but more importantly, to protect the principal that's already under management, a little bit more creativity goes a long way. What we do know is that reacting to a situation is a lot more expensive than predicting, anticipating, and dealing with it ahead of time. And again, at the beginning of this meeting, if I see a car crash is coming when I'm traveling, say, for example, 150 miles an hour, I think I might choose to apply the brakes, right? And that's where we are right now. Everything is moving too fast to actually do crisis. Having done crisis management now for a long time, things are moving too quickly. By the time the crisis has occurred, it's too late. And so there's a lot of people on this meeting today. If you're not in front of the crisis, then you're behind it. And you're not only kind of behind it, you're never going to regain the ground that you lost. And so, you start looking at multiples of downside risk. And moreover, I'm going to make one observation. If a family office loses their cyber insurance, good luck, because that's going to have implications on everything else that you do. And I think that it's up to the underwriters that are actually doing cyber insurance. With all due respect, we saw this after 9/11 as it relates to chemical biological warfare. If organizations that are underwriting our economic infrastructure on the private sector side don't start to hold people's feet to the fire, then I think we're not doing all we can do. And what the underwriters do has to be tracked and mapped by the government, both at the state level and the federal level, and the international levels as well. That would be my short answer.
Michael, can solutions from the defense and law enforcement community be applied in deploying to a customized fashion for family offices?
It's a strong question. We talk to people in governments, and obviously the private sector, whether it's finance or healthcare, daily. The one thing when I'm asked that question, insofar as, for example, I have the government asking what best practices can be adopted from the private sector, right? And then the private sector asking the same question about what can be adopted from the government. I think the first thing, there was a meeting that took place back in the fall that had to do with cyber terrorism, or the potential of cyber terrorism or cyber interruption as it relates to some special high profile events. And it brought the best of people from government, and it brought the people from the private sector that also really knew what they were doing together in one room confidentially, not only to discuss the threat, but the possibility and probabilities of what might unpack. And then from there, how to plan to mitigate that. And I think that, we are part of government. We fund it, we finance it, and government's part of us because they regulate us and they, ask us to invest in it. I think that there has to be a better sharing of best practices between the public and the private sector, whether it's the state level, the field office level, the FBI, the Secret Service, and others, as well as at the federal level. A lot of very large, James Q. Wilson had it right. Bureaucracy is bureaucracy, and it doesn't matter if it's governmental or non-governmental. They both suffer from the same problems. And anytime you get into a very large organization, I have been shocked in working with some super large, 5 largest corporations on the face of the earth. And they really, it's one thing to talk about country to country, but even within that country or within a particular business unit, one person may not know another person. And so when you're dealing with these very large enterprises of 2, 3, 4, 500,000 people, I can't really tell the difference between talking to people in the Department of Defense and a large corporation. It's all the same information stovepiping, and a lack of cross-pollination, not only between stovepipes, but in the organization in and of itself, and not even going to the meta level, the higher level, insofar as how those corporations talk with their peer groups as it relates to trade associations, and then how those trade associations actually communicate with governmental officials, whether it's legislative or executive, and changing policy that's beneficial and a win-win to everybody. We are all in this together. If we continue to lose 10% and growing of the global economy and the national economy as well. It's going to be pretty difficult to pay down our debt. It's going to be pretty difficult to have social programs. It's going to be pretty difficult to finance defense. And it's bad enough with a large percentage of our annual budget going just to finance the service on the debt. So
Indeed.
I submit to you that not only corporations, but governments need to start communicating.
Michael, what are some of the primary threats that should concern a family office, and what would be the solutions to prioritize? I guess we always do have to prioritize for immediate implementation.
Well, I'm gonna kind of pull back on you a little bit, Angela. I think that it's important to do a threat and vulnerability risk assessment, which has to basically be taken down to the individual corporation. And part of our threat and vulnerability risk assessment today starts out with, what's your corporate governance model? Do you even view what we're going to probably find in a threat and vulnerability risk assessment? Do you even have any tangible understanding of it beyond your CIO or your CISO? And so it is my opinion, and that of my company, that the primary threat is a lack of perception, a lack of imagination, and a lack of taking things seriously that are here and are very real today. So I think the first threat is an absence of looking ahead and an absence of creativity and being open to hearing things that are incredibly existential and terrifying to many, and they should be. But we've entered a realm, and I'm not sure how long it's going to last, where the lines of reality are increasingly blurred. And I think it's really super tough to start talking about what the threats are, if the decision makers who are there to interpret the threat cannot interpret between what's real and what's false. And that's where deep fakes come in. The amount of traffic and the amount of growth that we've seen in deep fakes over the last months or more has gotten transcendently worse. And with, the internet ecosystem and social media, mobile devices, et cetera, and the fact that people are looking at shorter and shorter time snippets of reality makes things ever more complex. So if you have the right governance model, if you have the right decision intelligence, and if you have the right decision makers at the table, that's where the threat and vulnerability risk assessment can actually take place. And from the threat and vulnerability risk assessment, that's how you basically start to see the gaps and the vulnerabilities and hopefully plan for it and make the investments necessary to defend yourself. So you don't have a catastrophic event where either your assets under management or your returns or those organizations that you're invested in get blindsided and shut down. What happened just since the beginning of 2024 that's in the public with very, very large organizations in finance and healthcare and aviation and utilities and telecom, I don't understand how we get a much more compelling event. I know that the media should really take a hard swallow at the lack of attention that they give to this matter. And until decision makers are going to start looking ahead, getting the right information and the right corporate governance models, it wouldn't matter if I present a threat and vulnerability risk assessment to them if they can't really understand it and if they can't do anything with it.
Very good point. As we're heading to a close, and before we get to what families should be doing from assessing the risk as well as potentially solutions, what would be a question that perhaps I didn't ask that you think is unasked that's very important for whoever may be listening, including family offices, on this subject to understand?
What is a question that I would ask?
Yes.
I guess the first issue is, what is your perception of your vulnerability or your exposure to cyber risk? Are you connected to the internet? Do you use a phone? Do you have confidential information in your possession that, if it gets out, is going to compromise your existence, or your assets or your interactions with others? Do you have, I mean, just really, it's so fundamental, Angelo, it's almost impossible to pull back. The greatest compelling event, unfortunately, that we find in organizations reaching out to us, either organizations that look at, things like penetration testing, or, the more mechanical and sensor-driven information and warning systems, they come to SedoGravitas to basically talk about how to look much more forward and actually try to think about models by and where we can architect the entire framework and approach and architecture of those indications and warning networks, right? Those systems that are going to provide you a snapshot with what may be coming ahead. So, I mean, what are the threats? The biggest threat is really internal. And what do we do as a solution to that? Is to try and bring folks in independently, but trustworthy, that can kind of give you some kind of, frankly, wake-up call before it's a difficult situation for the company, for your employees, and for your customers and your investors.
And Michael, talk a little bit, I'll give you the floor, relative to if I'm a family office and I'm watching or listening to you and you get my attention, kind of what would potentially be next steps? Talk a little bit about it, of the process, your systems, the assessment that you make, the opportunity to offer prospective solutions about all the grave concerns that you brought up today.
Thanks, Angela. Really, colleagues of mine like to say it all starts with a phone call. It all starts with a conversation. I think the first thing is, either, engaging with me directly, which isn't terribly hard. Just don't do it on LinkedIn, please. Or one of my team. Our team is comprised of international leaders, and everything as diverse as international law, cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and counterterrorism. We have sat at the table and actually dealt with state actors and non-state actors with the same bias or lack of bias thereof. Unfortunately, with the acceleration of information technology, a lot of tools that used to be in the exclusive domain of the government, or governments, plural, have bifurcated over to private sector, organizations, legitimate and illegitimate. So I think it all starts with a conversation. And, you cannot do a threat and vulnerability risk assessment over the phone. It's not the way it works. And the sensitivity of what we're actually talking about, whether it's analyzing organizational behavior, or decision-making, or decision intelligence, these are all fairly sensitive matters. So it first, becomes a call between principals in my firm and the firm that's looking at engaging with somebody, having that conversation, finding out if there's a cultural compatibility, and if they actually even have or think they have a problem. It's really typically about 5 minutes, and we can tell them, here's the problem, and this is how we can start to deal with it. So the way that we engage begins with a conversation. Once you've actually retained us and engaged us, then we basically take a very, very hard look at the threat, at the vulnerabilities and the risk. And then typically what we do from there is aggregate this information, pour in a good measure of creativity and, best practices from films and special effects and other things that are used to suspend disbelief. No, I really do mean this. I mean, again, I think it was in one of the prior interviews that you and I had together, I was looking at books that were 25 and 30 years old, on how to take down a nation state or how to take down a network as a reference point. This is not really, I mean, if you go to the science fiction, aisle and look at books that are 20, 30, 50 years old, this construct of what we're talking about with cybercrime and cyber terrorism, it's certainly not new. And now the lines have blurred between things in the Matrix, and this gets to deep fakes for a moment. The film, of course, a film that was supposed to be fictitious, which was The Undeclared War with Simon Pegg, and what's happening in our daily lives. If you would tell me that hundreds or tens of millions of people are going to have their social security numbers and all of their financial records compromised in one event with a major telco, wow. Okay, what happened? Nothing. It was in the news for 24 hours and then it was kind of gone. But those people who are actually receiving of all this, it tends to be a persistent problem and an ongoing long-term cost. So what do? We do a threat and vulnerability risk assessment. We take a look at the corporate governance and their entire attitude and approach to how they're viewing reality and their risk. And really, is there an inherent willingness to change organizationally and internally? From there, if they're into it, we like to spend a day or two with them in a boardroom environment, where we present them with particular challenges and scenarios that tend to be terribly realistic, and see how they manage them. And the whole purpose of, and we refer to that as wargaming, right? So the whole purpose of doing that is to get people to recognize that, yes, they are vulnerable. So you create a compelling event. And even though the events that you're discussing may not be real per se, they're real enough to give you some understanding as to how people behave. I have been in war games that were well facilitated with very, very senior people in the room, and people frequently get so frustrated they are inclined to get up and walk out of the room because the scenario that's being presented to them is so realistic and so frustrating they actually don't know what to do. We don't try to always push it to that level, but we don't try to keep it too far away from that. And I go back to something that I talk about rather frequently, is that, here in the United States, in anticipation that we were going to have a war in the Pacific in the Second World War, the Naval War College, with the participation of Admiral Chester Nimitz, did a lot of wargaming as to what they were probably going to experience in the war in the Pacific. And Nimitz would write at the end of the Second World War that it was wargaming. It was doing these alternative futures that allowed them to see creatively and out of the box enough, with enough distance to gain perspective on what could occur. And then they planned and budgeted for it. I'm submitting to the people who are watching this now, all right, or who engage with us, to realize that these things can be incredibly impactful for the organization from a planning, strategy, and budgetary standpoint, but can open our eyes to a full range of things. And I know that we've put the onus here on cybercrime and cyber terrorism, but it's really important as we start thinking about the investment in working with organizations like my own and our partners. What can be the upside that isn't so negative and apocalyptic and existential? And that is tools that we're actually looking at, Angela, whether it's wargaming or future alternative scenarios and things like this, have been used for decades by corporations, very large and successful ones. When Exxon and the other oil heavies were dealing with the oil embargo in the 70s, they weren't really sure where it was going to go and what the supply chain was going to look like. And to their credit, and I think some credit's due here, and kind of an ironic pointer, is that it was the oil industry that actually started looking at solar, and it was the oil industry that started looking at alternative energy supplies and a number of other things that are incredibly environmental and incredibly constructive and could be very lucrative downstream. I think in this situation, what we're dealing with is, yeah, if you don't do anything, if you don't look ahead, catastrophe is an option. However, if you have the framework and the tools, the right approach and the right attitude to say, I hadn't thought of that, or maybe I could think about this differently, the financial opportunities that are there are amazing. And it just takes a little bit of letting go, pulling a little bit back. And just in the same way, since we're kind of coming out of summer right now, when we get in that respective beach and we're hanging out and we're not at the office and stuff like that, and we're reading an incredibly good book that we really have wanted to read for a long time, and it even though it's fiction or science fiction or whatever, it let us think just a little bit differently. And because it was fiction, or under the umbrella of being fiction, it's not threatening, nor is it so amazing that we actually take it seriously. What I'm submitting here is that we need to pull back and, again, use this ability to look forward with the right decision intelligence to not only increase our financial returns, but financial returns in areas that we hadn't even thought of. And that's really what we do as a company. It's not all doom and gloom and apocalypse and your company's going to go away, your employees are going to be sad, your reputation is going to be burnished, you're never going to go to any more parties in the Hamptons, nor will you even be invited or considered. You're going to be dropped off the email list. You're not part of the chat groups anymore, and no one wants your money at the Met. So, I mean, it's not always got to be that. It can be how to create an entirely new industry sector. And that's the other thing that we do here, is that there's a tremendous upside. And what I want my clients and our partners to be thinking about more so is, how do we make things better, not just defend ourselves against preventing the worst.
And Michael, for those that would like to learn more and reach out, how could they do so?
Thanks, Angelo. If they basically email you, then you can put me in touch with them. I would prefer not to put my signal phone number out here. But through our website, which is SedoGravitas.com, SedoGravitas.com, then we'll get in touch with you fairly quickly. Unfortunately, LinkedIn has become a little bit too pedestrian and too much not useful.
Of course. And simply in my close, this is a long overdue subject for me to cover. Many of you know I'm very active in deep tech and in AI. And actually this summer I did a whole bunch of write-ups, which I don't do as much anymore, on the subject, mainly leading to the advent of AGI and super intelligence, and how I think the impact will be in the family office world. Actually, this Friday live, and also a more condensed webinar podcast, I have a mutual discussion with R. Adam Smith, talking about looking not that far in the future, 2030, and the impact on so many things relative to that. So these are very important subjects. To ignore them would simply be ignorant and foolish, and the opportunity of addressing them with thought leaders that I know, like Michael, and how I learn as well, I think from a family office perspective, is very valuable. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of Family Office TV and on YouTube. Don't forget, I have 2 platforms, including my much larger @Family Office. I have a new Rumble account, and that's going to get some unique content, although less frequent. And on Apple and Spotify in a traditional podcasting format. Some of you reached out and said you still prefer that. You drive a lot. There's a variety of factors. So I listened, and selectively, I'm most active on YouTube, but the other platforms, go and subscribe. Angelo Robles Podcast on Apple or Spotify. You could reach out to me at angelorobles.com. Simply my name, my email, and how to communicate with me is on there. And I'm always happy, more so for my members, but to make favorable and direct introductions to guest and select experts and what I call kind of dream team folk that I know. So those of you from a live perspective, we have a very busy week. Stay tuned, including what I mentioned before on kind of the future 2030 family office that's upcoming at 11 a.m. this Friday, only a couple of days away, and lots of amazing things and great guests between that. It's always a pleasure to learn from Michael, to have him on. I greatly appreciate it. I highly encourage learning more, going to the website, interacting, or worst case, if you wanted to utilize me as an intermediary, I don't mind. That's why I'm here. And connecting the dots is among the most important things that I do. So I'm happy to help from that perspective. Thank you all. Michael, I appreciate you being a great guest. Thank you today for your time.
Thank you, Angelo. I want to thank you for putting this together in very short order. And to everybody out there, I really appreciate your time. And my door is open to you. And anything that we can do to improve our stability as a country and corporations, then let's make it happen. Angelo, and to the audience, I thank you again, and have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.